Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline from KnittingHouseSquare and today I have a fun fall knitting tutorial for you. So this one is part of a two-part series. So also being released this week are two pumpkin videos. So the one that you're currently watching is for this cable knit pumpkin. So this one is more for an advanced beginner knitter or an intermediate knitter. So in this cable knit pumpkin video, what I'm going to be taking you through is first the setup of the pumpkin. So how do we join in the round? We're using magic loop to knit this. The increases that we're using, how to insert the cables, decreases, and then the cast off. Then we'll knit the cute little stem separately. And then lastly, we'll come back and we'll assemble everything together. Now these make really cute fall decorations. And one little inspiration that I have here is a cute little stack of pumpkins. All I do to make the different sizes is I knit this pattern out of different weights of yarn. So this topmost pumpkin here, this is a fingering weight pumpkin, and this is just my pumpkin knit flat video, so another one coming out this week. Then just below that, I think this is sport weight, check on my website to verify, but this is a cable knit pumpkin. And then lastly, we have another pumpkin knit flat. So you can really mix and match these two different pumpkin videos I'm putting out this week. I think that just looks adorable, all stacked up like that. Another one I have here is an example. This one is knit out of bulky weight yarn. Sorry if you can hear my dog walking around below me right now. She's decided to come in the room. So I think that this would also look really cute if you took kind of like the stack of pumpkins and leaned this one up against it. Just so many fun fall decorating ideas with this. So what I'm going to be taking you through first in this video is the knitting of the pumpkin. And again, this one is knit in the round. If you're looking for a more beginner friendly version, check out my other video for the pumpkin knit flat, where that one is not knit in the round. So I'm going to take you through the working of the pumpkin, then the stem, and then lastly the assembly. On my website, you're going to find the full written version of the pattern. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below. Let's get started. So the way this video tutorial is going to be structured, first we're going to go through knitting of the pumpkin portion, then we're going to go through knitting the stem, and then lastly we're going to assemble it all together. So to start off, I just have my materials in front of me for the pumpkin. I have a cable needle, a tapestry needle, pair of scissors, my yarn. So this is one of my favorite pumpkin yarns to use just because I love the color. So this one, it's hard to find now, but I bought this one off of Amazon. It's Vanna's Choice. It's a worsted weight, so it has the medium or number 4 there. And the color is terracotta. You actually can use any different weight you would like to for this pumpkin. Just what you want to do is you want to pick out your knitting needles to correspond to whatever size is recommended for the yarn. So this yarn recommends a US 9 knitting needle. So I'm going to be using a US 9 knitting needle. If you're using something like a heavier weight yarn, this one I don't have the tag with me, but this yarn recommended a 10.5, so I used a 10.5 to knit this pumpkin. So use whatever size knitting needle your yarn recommends. And in the pattern on my website, I'll have lists of different weights of yarn I used with the finished measurements of the pumpkin, as well as the yardage that I used. Now to start off, all I have in front of me is my knitting needle, my yarn, and I also have my pattern loaded onto my tablet in front of me. And what I want to do first is cast on 12 stitches. So you can use any cast on method you'd like. Some of the ones I recommend are things like the backward loop cast on if you're looking for something very simple, or a stretchy cast on like the long tail cast on or the German twisted cast on. So cast on 12 stitches using whatever method you'd like. Okay, so I have my 12 stitches cast on, and now we want to join in the round. So this whole video, I'm going to be showing you knitting in the round using magic loop. If you'd like to, you could always use double pointed needles instead. Now how it works for magic loop is you want to slide all of your stitches to the cord of your knitting needle, and you want to count in halfway. So we want to find the 6th stitch. Okay, so my middle point is right there on my cord. I have 6 stitches on either side. Now what I want to do is I want to hold onto the cord right there in the middle, fold the cord, and then pull on it gently so that each half of the stitches ends up on one knitting needle. I'm going to slide them towards the tops of the knitting needles. Now what you want to end up with is you want to turn your work and arrange your knitting needles so that both of the knitting needle points are going over towards the right. And you want to make sure your working yarn, so your yarn attached to your ball, is coming out the knitting needle further away from you. So if you had something like this, where your working yarn is coming out the knitting needle closer to you, you just want to flip them over so it's coming out the one further away from you. Your yarn tail, you can just kind of leave off to the side there. You also want to make sure all those cast on bumps are going down towards the table. That helps to ensure that your work isn't twisted as you look at these 12 stitches. So I have all those cast on bumps down to the table, knitting needle points going over towards the right, and my working yarn, I'm good at grabbing the wrong strand here, is coming out my knitting needle further away. Now last up, you want to take your working yarn and you want to bring it up in between your 2 knitting needles, and then you just want to drape it over your back knitting needle. Now the reason you want to place it like this is because we're going to be knitting the first round. So if you're knitting the next stitch, you want your working yarn to be going up in between, draped over the back knitting needle. If you're about to start purling, you could leave your yarn down below. So we're going to leave it draped up over that back knitting needle. Now this whole first round says that we're doing knit front and back of each stitch. So to work one round, we have to work across both knitting needles. So I want to knit front, knit back all the way across the 6 stitches on my front knitting needle. Then I'm going to turn my work and knit front, knit back all the way across the 6 stitches on my back knitting needle. Once I've worked across both knitting needles, that'll be one full round. So first, to work across our front knitting needle, you want to take your back knitting needle and gently pull it towards the right. Now when you do that, your back stitches will end up on the cord, and you want to make sure you still have plenty of cord over here on the left-hand side, but make sure you still have enough room to like move around this right knitting needle. Now you just want to go right into that first stitch knitwise. Make sure you're using the working yarn, and you want to knit the first stitch. Now this is a knit front, knit back, so don't slip that stitch off your knitting needle yet. Now go into the back of the same stitch and knit through the back of the same stitch. So we just turned that one stitch into 2. Now we're going to repeat that again. So I'm going to knit regularly into the next stitch. Don't slip it off. Before I slip it off, go into the back of the same stitch, knit, and then slip it off. So now I have 4 over here on my right-hand side. I'm going to continue working knit front and back all the way across this knitting needle. Now when I finish going across, there's going to be no stitches left over here on my left-hand knitting needle. And over here on my knitting needle in my right hand, I should have turned those 6 stitches now into 12 stitches. So you can count across to double check your work. Once you verify that you have 12 stitches, we're ready to work across the second half of the round. So the way we want to do that is we want to flip our knitting needle. So instead of pointing over towards the left, it's pointed over towards the right. Now we want to thread back in our second knitting needle. So when I look at my work right now, both of my knitting needles are pointed over towards the right-hand side. My working yarn is coming out the back knitting needle, or the one further away from me. And I want to make sure my working yarn is coming up in between the 2 knitting needles, and then it's draped over that back knitting needle. Again, because we're going to be working something purlwise across the next half of the round. So to start working, again, I'm just going to make sure all my bumps are going down towards the table. I'm going to take my back knitting needle, pull it towards the right. Again, when I pull it towards the right, those stitches are gonna end up on the cord. I make sure I still have plenty of cord over here on the left-hand side. And now I'm just gonna go right into that first stitch on this half of the stitches and work that knit front and back all the way across these 6 stitches. So knit front, knit back. Once I finish going across, no stitches over here on the left. I'm gonna rotate my work. So my knitting needle point is going over towards the right, and I'm gonna thread back in my second knitting needle. Now that I just finished, that was 1 round. So you have to work across both knitting needles before you've worked 1 round. I should have completed that round with a total of 24 stitches across both of my knitting needles. So I have 12 and 12. Now the next round is just a knit round. So doing this, again, I wanna make sure my working yarn is coming up between, draped over my back knitting needle, and that will be the same all the way up throughout the pumpkin. You'll always be starting off with a knit. We're gonna take our back knitting needle, pull it towards the right, and now I'm just gonna knit all the way across the first half of the stitches. Turn my work, thread back in the other knitting needle. Make sure all my work is going out of the bottom down towards the table. Working yarn is coming up in between the knitting needles, draped over the back knitting needle. Now you have to knit across the second knitting needle as well, and then we'll have worked 1 full knit round. Turn my work, thread back in the second knitting needle. All my work is coming out down towards the table. So that was just increase setup round 1 and increase setup round 2. So we've gone from 12 stitches all the way up until 24. Now we want to work setup rounds 3 and 4, which are essentially repeats of what we just worked. So first for setup round 3, we're going to work knit front, knit back into each one of these stitches, going all the way across both knitting needles. So once you complete that round, you should have a total of 48 stitches on your knitting needles. And then you just want to knit 1 more round. So once you've completed setup rounds 3 and 4, I'll catch back up with you to show you where we're really going to start this pumpkin pattern. Now that we've worked the increase setup rounds, we're going to work the increase rounds. So a little bit different here. The increase setup rounds were essentially just increasing or doubling our stitches each time we went around with knit rounds in between. What we're going to be working next is taking our pumpkin pattern, and this is viewing the bottom of the pumpkin, so this is my cast on edge here. We're going to divide the pumpkin into 6 different areas, each with the exact same repeat going across. So because we're knitting this using magic loop, I'm going to have 3 repeats on my front knitting needle and 3 repeats on my back knitting needle. This will also be the portion where we start introducing in the cable stitches. Starting off with increase row 5, you'll see that in this row, you have the option to place a stitch marker. So there's little asterisks, and in between each set of asterisks, it says knit 1, make 1, knit 5, make 1, knit 1, purl 1, and then place a stitch marker. So I'll show you exactly what that means. So first, making sure your yarn up in between your 2 knitting needles draped over the back. We're gonna knit our first stitch. Then we need to work what's called a make 1. So a make 1 is where we're increasing. And the way we're gonna increase is we're gonna pick up the bar in between the stitch we just worked and the one we're about to work. And we're gonna pick up that bar going from the front towards the back. So let me zoom in here. So that topmost bar right there is what I'm picking up. I'm gonna pick that up with my left knitting needle, going from the front to the back, and then I wanna knit into the back of that stitch. Then I can slide it off of my left knitting needle. Now I need to knit 5. Then I need to make 1 again. So now I want to pick up the bar in between the stitch I just worked and the one I'm about to work using my left knitting needle point. Then I'm going to knit into the back of that loop. Lastly, I need to knit 1 and then purl 1. Now that repeat that we just did is where we're going to continue doing all the way across our 2 knitting needles. So you should be able to work this repeat exactly 6 times. You also now have the option to place a stitch marker right here, which will identify where each one of your repeats are. I also find that I often don't need to add stitch markers here just because I have the 1 purl stitch, and the purl stitch helps me remember exactly where each one of my repeats are. So I use the purl stitch as my identifier for where 1 repeat ends. So next up, I'm gonna do it all over again. So I'm gonna knit 1, then I'm gonna make 1. So picking up the bar from front to back, knitting into the back, knitting 5, make 1, knit 1, purl 1. So that purl 1 is the end of that little repeat section. I'm going to continue working this pattern 1 more time across my front knitting needle and then 3 times across my back knitting needle to finish up this round. Now, once you finish increase round 5, the next round, and this is gonna happen every time after an increase round, is we're just gonna work kind of like being in pattern. So what we wanna do is we wanna knit all the way up until a purl stitch, then we wanna purl the purl stitch. So the way you can tell where the purl stitches are, the purl stitches have the bump in the front. So I'm gonna knit all the way across. So in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stitches. And then I'm gonna purl 1. You can also use your stitch markers if you have that. So you wanna knit all the way up until 1 stitch before your stitch marker, purl that stitch, and then pass your stitch marker. So I wanna work knitting all the way up until the purl, purling, knitting all the way up until the purl, purling, all the way across this full round. Now in increase row 7 is where we're going to introduce in the cables for the first time. So first, let me work across my first repeat until I get to that C6. So first I have knit 1, then make 1, knit 1, and now it says C6. So what C6 means is that we're cabling with 6 stitches total. So I'm gonna grab my cable needle, and this little cable needle I got at my local yarn shop. It is one of these Coco Knits curved cable needles. I like the metal ones. I'll link to a few on Amazon down below if you're curious. And how we work a cable 6 is we're gonna take half of the 6 stitches, or 3 stitches, and slide them onto the cable needle, and we want to hold that cable needle in the front of our work. Now we want to knit the next 3 stitches from our left hand knitting needle, And then we want to go back to our cable needle and we want to knit the 3 stitches being held on the cable needle. So we took 3 stitches, moved them across the front over towards the left, and that was a C6. Now across the pattern in different rows, so if you look all the way down to increase row 11, it says cable 8. That's essentially the exact same thing, just you're gonna put half of the 8 stitches or 4 stitches on your cable needle and hold those in front and work 4 stitches from the left-hand knitting needle. So you would just be dividing it into 4 and 4. Now across the rest of this little repeat for row 7, we have make 1 next. So make 1 right next to the cable. Sometimes that one wants to get a little tight. Knit 1, and then purl 1. So that is the end of one repeat. If you have the stitch marker, you now want to pass the stitch marker. So we're going to work that one more time as an example here. So we're going to knit 1, make 1, knit 1, cable 6. So I'm slipping 3 stitches onto my cable needle, holding it in the front, half of the 6 stitches, then I'm knitting 3 from my left-hand knitting needle, and now I'm going to knit the 3 being held on my cable needle. Now I'm going to make 1. Try that one more time. Make 1, knit 1, purl 1. And then again, if you were using a stitch marker, you would pass the stitch marker. You will notice also that the cable isn't perfectly centered. So on the one side, we do knit 1, make 1, knit 1, then the cable. And then on the other side, we don't start off with a knit 1, we just go right into the make 1. The reason for that is there's an odd number of stitches because of that purl stitch. So everything, including the purl stitch, makes it even, in case you are curious about that. So now I'm going to continue working through some of these increase rounds, and I'm going to keep on working all the way through increase row, looking at my pattern here, increase row 14. And you also want to make sure as you're working these, couple things to keep in mind. After each increase row where you're making one, you want to work the knit and purl rounds. So you're knitting all the way up until each purl stitch, purling the purl stitch. You also want to keep in mind what size cable is being used. So I just showed you increase round 7, which has the cable size 6. There's also increase round 11, which has the cable 8. So pay attention to which size cable you're using in each row. Another thing to make sure you're doing is also make sure you're working across both knitting needles as one whole round. Now that we've gone all the way up through those increases, we're ready to work the center portion of the pumpkin. So what this center portion is it'd be somewhere right around this region. We're still working the cabling pattern up through the center, but we aren't increasing on either side. This center portion ends up being about 14 rows total, and you can see where it begins down here. So each one of these little diagonal bars, those are my make ones. And then you'll see the diagonal bars stop for a bit, then they start again. So this whole portion where they stopped are going to be these center rows. So many of them you're just going to be working in pattern where you just knit and sometimes cable, knit all the way up until the purl stitch, purl it, and then continue repeating that all the way across. Do pay attention though where the cabling rows do appear. All of them are cable 8s. So for instance, the first center row has a cable 8 where you knit 5, then work a cable 8, knit 4, purl 1. So pay close attention to those cable rows. I do find it's helpful in this portion of the pattern, especially if you have it printed out, to highlight as you go along. That way you make sure you keep the pattern where it's you cable every 4th row. So I'm gonna work through those center rows. And again, just to emphasize, make sure you aren't working those increases or those make ones anymore. Your number of stitches is gonna stay exactly the same. for those 14 rounds, and then I'll come back and I'll show you what we work a little bit differently in these decrease rounds up here at the top of the pumpkin. Last up, we have the decreases. So for the decreases, what we're going to be doing on either side of each repeat is first over here on the right side of each repeat, we're going to be working a left leaning decrease. We'll be working a slip, slip, knit. We're still going to continue working the cabling up the center. And then over here on the left side of each repeat, we're going to be working a right leaning decrease, which will be our knit two together. So I'll just show one of these rows here. I'm about to work decrease row, and this is row 29. So first up, I have knit one. Then I have slip, slip, knit, which is my left leaning decrease. So first I'm going to slip the first stitch as if I'm knitting it, slip the next stitch as if I'm knitting it, pass them both back over to my left knitting needle, and then you want to knit them together through the back. So that decrease should tilt over there towards the left. Now I'm going to knit 11. Now I need my right leaning decrease, which is a knit two together. So I'm going to take the next two stitches on my left knitting needle, insert my right knitting needle going from the left towards the right under the base, wrap my yarn around and pull through. So that decrease should tilt over towards the right. Then I have knit one, purl one, and then pass your stitch marker if you're using the stitch markers. We would repeat it again. So knit one, slip, slip, knit. So slipping the next two stitches as if I'm knitting them, passing them both back over to my left knitting needle, working them together through the back, knit 11, knit two together. So going into the base of the next two stitches, starting over here on the left towards the right, knit one, purl one. So that's an example of how these decrease rounds are worked. Again, pay attention to where the cables are going to go, and also pay attention to the size of the cables. For some of these rows, you'll have the 8-stitch cable, so putting 4 on your cable needle, then working 4 on the other side. Also the 6-stitch cable, kind of as you go up, you start tapering down. So we also have a 6-stitch cable, and then a 4-stitch cable as well. So that's where you just have 2 and 2 on either side. Also, in between each one of these decrease rounds where we're working the slip, slip, knit and the knit two together, you are going to have those rounds where you work in pattern. So just knitting all the way across until the purl stitch and purling that stitch. So now I'm going to continue working all the way up through decrease row 38. And when I'll come back, I'll show you rows 39, 40, and 41 and how to hold your stitches at the end of the pumpkin. You actually don't want to close it all the way up. So you can see this one I still have on my knitting needles. We want to do something special up here at the top so that there's still an opening, because we need this opening to kind of give the pumpkin its pumpkin shape and also to add in all of the filling. So I will come back and show you row 39. These last few decrease rounds, we're going to be decreasing at a bit faster of a pace. And now it's going to be a combination of the slip, slip, knit, which we've done before, the knit two together, which we've also done before, and then we're adding in a purl two together. So the way the repeat works is essentially in between, including the purl stitch for each one, you start off with 8 stitches, and our goal is to get it down to 4. So first I'm going to start off with a slip, slip, knit, then another slip, slip, knit, a knit two together, and then yarn to the front, a purl two together. And this purl two together should include that purl stitch. And that's the repeat I'm gonna do all the way across the round. Okay, and for the last two rounds, we have just one where we work in patterns. So we're gonna knit 3, purl 1, repeat all the way across. And then finally, we're gonna have slip, slip, knit, purl 2 together, repeat all the way across. So once you finish those 2 final decrease rounds, you should be left with 12 stitches on your knitting needle, 6 on either one, 12 total. Now that I finished that final round, I'm gonna thread back in my knitting needle. And for this next step, I need my tapestry needle and scissors. I'm gonna cut my yarn, leaving a fairly long tail, so probably about 24 inches here. And I'm gonna thread that tail onto the tapestry needle. Now I want to go around this circle in the order that I would knit and slide the stitches onto the tapestry needle. So I'm going to start slipping at my front knitting needle here and just pass each stitch onto the tail. And I'm going to turn my work, pull the knitting needle to the other side so that I can keep going all the way around the circle. And now slide each one of these onto the yarn tail. When I finish that, I'm gonna make sure they all end up on the yarn tail, but I don't actually want to pull it tight. So right now it's getting caught on something. Let me just pull this through a little bit further. You want to make sure it remains a nice open circle there. That way we can use that for stuffing the pumpkin. And we can also use that, we're gonna have to weave yarn through these columns of purl stitches, so we can use that opening to do that as well. For now, I'm gonna take this pumpkin, set it to the side, and next up I'm gonna show you how to knit the stem. Now the last piece I have to knit is the stem. So in front of me I have the same weight of yarn that I used for my pumpkin. So I used medium weight or worsted weight number 4. So I just have my stem color, same exact knitting needles that I used for the pumpkin, and a pair of scissors. So first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cast on 8 stitches. You can use any cast on method you'd like. You do just wanna leave a little bit of a cast on tail. I usually like to leave around 12 inches or so extra. So that way we can use that later on to kind of give the stem a little bit of a curl at the top. So I'm gonna cast on 8. And now I'm gonna join in the round. I'm using magic loop again, so same method we used for the pumpkin. Find 4 stitches in, divide it in half, and then slide each half of the stitches up to the knitting needle points. Make sure the working yarn is coming out the knitting needle furthest away, so I have to rotate mine. Work is going down towards the table, and knitting needle points are going over towards the right. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm actually just gonna continue knitting round after round until my work measures 1.5 inches. So grab a ruler as well. And so knitting round after round, main thing you want to keep in mind as you're starting here is because you're knitting, you want the working yarn to come up in between your 2 knitting needles and drape it over the back to start. So I will knit for a bit and then I'll catch back up with you once it's 1.5 inches. Last up, we have a few increase rounds to create the larger base of the stem. So first increase round, we're gonna work a repeat of knit 1, make 1. So the make 1 is exactly the same as it was for the pumpkin portion. So you wanna pick up the bar in between the stitch you just worked and the one you're about to work. Using your left knitting needle from front to back, knit into the back of it, and then knit one. And repeat that all the way across the round. So again, it was knit one, make one, then knit one. I'm going to do it on the second half of the stitches. Now, after working that first increase round, I'm just going to knit one full round. For the next increase round, now we want to switch from having 12 stitches all the way up until 24. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to work the repeat knit one, make one, all the way across the round. So knit one, make one, knit one, make one, knit one, make one. And the only place this is a little bit more tricky to see is at the edges. So let me show you how I do that. Make one over there. So to do the last make one on the front side, you just basically stretch out your edge a little bit there, and then your left knitting needle currently doesn't have anything on it. So just again, pick up that bar, and then you can knit into the back of it. Then turn your work, exact same thing on the second half of the stitches. And check your work once you're all done this round to make sure that you ended up with 24 stitches. Now again, in between, we're just gonna knit one full round. And for the last round here before we cast off, we're gonna double our stitch count again. So we wanna go from 24 stitches up to 48. And we're gonna do that by, again, alternating between knit one and make one. And I'm gonna add in a little bonus clip right here of an easier method that I'm currently doing for how to work a make one if you're having trouble putting the knitting needle through the back of the stitch. If you ever have trouble getting the make one to work, so a lot of times I have trouble getting my knitting needle to go into the back of the stitch right away. Another way you can do it is you can take your right knitting needle, put it into the front of that bar that you just picked up, and then just rotate that knitting needle to the back. So showing that one more time. Sometimes it's tricky to actually get your knitting needle to go behind the stitch. So what you can do instead is just take your right knitting needle, go into the front, and then just kind of roll it all the way to the back. So now you are knitting through the back, and then slide it off. Knit one, make one. I find it's usually trickier to do those make ones if you're working with something like I have right now where it's like slippery acrylic-y yarn. It can be a little bit harder. Okay, now that we've gone through that little bonus clip, let's get back to knitting the stem. Last up is the cast off. And the cast off method I'm going to be using is very simple. It's knit the first stitch, knit the second stitch. Now over here on your right knitting needle, pass the previous stitch up, over, and off. Then the repeat begins. So knit this next stitch from your left knitting needle. Then over here on your right knitting needle, use your left knitting needle to pass the previous stitch up, over, and off. Repeat again. So knit the next stitch, pass the previous stitch up, over, and off. And I'm going to do this all the way across the round. When you get to that end of the first knitting needle, all you want to do is hold the last stitch that you have over here on the right where that is, turn your work, and then thread your other knitting needle point onto the work. And then you can keep on just working the repeat. So knitting the next stitch, previous stitch, up, over, and off. That way it keeps that whole circle cast off edge going. Now, once you have the final stitch there, stretch that out a little bit. We're gonna cut our yarn. And again, you do wanna leave a little bit of a tail. So I probably have, well, it's probably about 18 inches there. I'm gonna cut my yarn, and then I thread my yarn tail through that last stitch. And when I get to seaming, I actually will close up that gap that forms kind of where the round started and where the round ends with this yarn tail. Now we have our two pieces. So the last step is going to be assembling. Last up for the assembly, what you're going to want to have in front of you are your two pieces. So I have my stem and my pumpkin. You'll want a pair of scissors, a tapestry needle, some of the yarn that you knit your pumpkin out of, and then lastly, I have this on the floor beside me, some of the stuffing. So the stuffing I'm using is the Silky Polyfill. Now, first up, what we need to do is we need to set the pumpkin up before we can stuff it. So I'm gonna take my pumpkin yarn and I'm gonna cut 3 strands of yarn. You want each of the strands of yarn to be long enough to weave down one side of the pumpkin and then come back up the other side with extra left over. So depending on what weight of yarn you use for your pumpkin, that measurement may be longer or shorter. I probably have about 24 inches here that I'm gonna cut my strands at. And I'm gonna cut 3 strands approximately the same length. Now with one of these strands, I'm gonna thread it onto my tapestry needle. And now I wanna pick any one of these columns of purl bumps. So I'm up here at kind of like that cast off edge where we went through the remaining stitches. I'm just gonna pick any one of the columns of purl stitches. And what I wanna do is I wanna pick the middle of that purl stitch, so like this column right here. I usually like to go underneath for 3, then above for 1, then underneath for 3, then above for 1, underneath for 3, above for 1. And as I'm going along, I'm gonna pull that yarn through the pumpkin. Make sure you leave a little tail up here at the top. So again, I just am up top right now, so I'm gonna go underneath for 3, above for 1, all the way down this purl column. Now down here at the bottom, we don't actually still have the purl stitches, so I kind of just go above and below every other. Now, I wanna go back up the pumpkin on the other side. So I'm gonna look for the exact opposite. Move that out of the way. The exact opposite column of purl stitches. So I just did this one right here. So I need to go up right over here on the other side. And again, I'm gonna do the exact same thing where now I'm starting on the opposite side. So I'm gonna go above and below a few times. And then I'm gonna start doing the go below for 3, above for 1. Now I'm coming out up there at the top. So that was these 2 columns of purl stitches. I want to do the exact same thing using my next strand of yarn that I cut, right? Doing the next set of purl, going down one side, up the other, and then use my 3rd strand to do the 3rd set where I go down one side and up the other. So when I finish, I should have essentially like 6 extra yarn tails up here at the top of the pumpkin. Now I've gone across and I've woven in those 3 strands, so I have all of those tails up here at the top of my pumpkin. And if I flip over my pumpkin to the bottom side, you can see I have my 3 strands kind of crossing over each other down there at the base. What I actually want to do before I stuff the pumpkin is I'm going to take this cast on tail that I have down here at the bottom. I'm going to thread it onto my tapestry needle. And now I'm going to close up this opening. So the way I do this is I typically just go around and pick up each one of these little cast on edges and then loop all the way across the pumpkin. Okay, once I get backward where I started, I'm just gonna pull on that edge, and now I should have closed up that opening. Now I do tie knots in my knitting, so I'm gonna tie a knot to secure this in place. I just pick one of the strands right around where it currently is, thread it through, and tie a little knot. Okay. Now that that side is all closed up, I'm gonna turn it back over. Real quick, something that's useful is if you just pull on these strands, just make sure that they move a little bit and you can see the opposite strand moving. That helps just to make sure that bottom edge, when we closed it up, didn't accidentally catch on any of those strands we have down there. So these look good. Let me just test this one. Okay, that one looks good too. Now what I'm gonna do next is we're gonna stuff the pumpkin. So I like to overfill it a bit. So I'm just gonna go through adding in smaller size balls of fluff over and over again until it reaches the fluffiness that I would like. There's definitely no perfect science to this. And as you're doing this, just make sure none of those yarn tails are accidentally going inside of the pumpkin. Now I think I have a good amount of fluff in my pumpkin, and one way to test to make sure you like what it's gonna look like is take 2 strands that are on opposite sides and just start pulling on them a little bit so that the sides of the pumpkin start puckering inwards almost. That'll give you a good idea of what it's gonna look like once those edges are pulled in. Okay, so I'm liking what my pumpkin's looking like. Next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start closing this top edge. So I wanna find my cast off tail, the one that I loosely threaded through each one of those top edge stitches. So this one isn't one of the ones I wove in. This one is actually the one that I cast off with. And I'm just gonna gently pull on that to close up that top circle. Now that that's in place, I'm gonna put that one off to the side. And now I wanna focus on the strands that are woven through those purl columns. And again, you wanna think about the opposite ones. So if you gently pull on one, it should tell you which one that's related to because the other side will start moving. So these two are associated with each other. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start tying a knot and I'm gonna pull them inwards until I like how much the pumpkin has pulled in. So I like that right there. And now once it's a spot I like, I'm gonna tie a double knot. Then I'm gonna move on to the next set of 2. That one's my cast off edge. So let's take this one and the one on the opposite side. Start tying a knot and pull in the pumpkin. I like the way that looks. So I'm gonna tie my double knot. Then last up, my third one should be these 2 strands. Single knot. Double knot. Okay, so now my pumpkin has taken on that more pumpkin-y shape. Last up, before we add the stem to the top, is we need to weave in these ends. So we've actually already tied knots with all of these ends. So all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the ends, put them on my tapestry needle, and then to weave them in, I'm just gonna thread them right near where they're coming out currently, through the pumpkin. Kind of got to move your needle a little bit to get through some of the stuffing, if you stuffed it as much as mine. Out the other side. Then you want to push down on your work a little bit. Cut that yarn tail, and then it'll just magically disappear into the middle of your pumpkin. So I'm going to keep on repeating that. With the strands on this side, a lot of times I'll actually weave them in sets of 2, just to make it a little bit faster. And I just realized too, as I was weaving these in, that I hadn't actually secured that cast off tail. So I'm going to secure that before I weave it in. And just make sure that top circle is nice and tight. Okay, now we have our pumpkin all set up. Last step we have here is to attach the stem. So I am going to take the cast off tail. So I don't want the one coming out the top of the stem. I want the one that we cast off with. And I'm gonna thread my tapestry needle with that tail. It does always kind of create a funky little edge there the way we cast it off. So what I like to do is first just weave it under the first stitch on the opposite side of that cast off edge, just to make it into a bit more of a full circle. And now I am going to sew that edge onto the top of my pumpkin. And you really can make either side the top of your pumpkin. I'm gonna leave the place I just tied all of those strands together as my top. And as I'm doing this, I don't do it exactly on the edge of the stem. I actually do it a little bit in. That way you keep this ruffle that was created because we had so many stitches we were casting off. So I just go a little bit inwards, pick up some of the orange pumpkin below. Then go up, thread it through part of the pumpkin that's a little bit further in, and then go back down, pick up a little bit of the orange. I'm going all the way around the circle that way. Again, try and keep some of that ruffle in the stem. Now, once I get all the way back over to the beginning, I'm gonna tie a little knot. You can tie it to the pumpkin, to the stem, wherever you'd like, as long as it's hidden. And then I'm gonna thread that pumpkin tail down through the pumpkin, out the other side, and then cut that strand. Now we only have one more yarn tail remaining, so I'm going to thread my tapestry needle with that. And now what I like to do with this yarn tail is I like to make it so it just curves a little bit. So I'm just going to take the stem, you can make it whatever shape you'd like, and I just weave it down just a little bit below where it started, and then I turn the strand to come out the side. So now if I look at this from the top, my stem looks like that. And I'm going to secure this to either if I have a stitch in here or to part of the stem, part of the pumpkin, anything you'd like. Again, as long as it's hidden. You can make it as tight or as loose as you'd like. And now weaving that end, as always, through the pumpkin. Thank you so much for joining me today as we knit this cable knit pumpkin. And of course, be sure to check out my other pumpkin tutorial I released this week, which is the pumpkin knit flat. Don't forget to subscribe so you stay up to date on all my future videos, and I'll see you next time.